Welcome to the second installment of our Spring 2023 Virtual Reality Speaker Series. This is brought to everyone by the School of Museum of Fine Arts at Tufts Virtual Reality Certificate Program. Throughout this semester, we've been inviting leading thinkers, practitioners, researchers, and designers to share their expertise in VR and to engage in conversation about where VR might be headed in the future. I'm your host. I'm Rebecca Plotkin. I'm the Director of Professional and Custom Education for University College. University College is a part of Tufts that focuses on expanding access to the university by producing high-quality academic programs that reach and meet students' unique needs at any stage of their educational journey. So let's dive right in. I'll introduce you to our panelists. Our first panelist is Krys Ziska Strange. She's the Associate Director of Faculty Development and Instructional Design here at Tufts. Krys has many years of expertise using technology in the classroom, both as an educator and as a designer. She currently teaches at the University of Arizona in instructional design and gaming cultures. Next, we have Nick Babich, who's a product designer specializing in user experience. His work focuses both on business and consumer digital products, including working on AI-powered products. His team has won numerous design awards, including the Red Dot Award. And lastly, but certainly not least, we have Kyle Monahan, who's a senior data scientist here at Tufts. Kyle uses statistical analysis, including GIS tools, to visualize and analyze data. He currently teaches a few different courses here at Tufts in data analytics and has been using virtual reality in a few different ways. I'll let our panelists tell you a little bit more about themselves and how they're using VR in their work, and then we'll dive into some questions. Krys, would you like to go first?
So VR has been gaining a lot of interest, especially in online learning, because you don't have the people in a space. And so we try to use VR in ways where you need to replicate the space. So at one of my early positions in instructional design, it was looking at chemistry. In other places, it's been how do we replicate hospitals or classrooms in ways so that we can have a controlled environment.
Thanks, Krys. Nick, I'll have you introduce yourself next and share a little bit about your work.
I work as a product designer, and my primary focus was introducing a practical VR in different contexts. So personally, I use VR, I explored the use of VR in the metaverse space, but practically I have more focused on creating the consumer experience, like using VR for onboarding. And using VR, as Krys mentioned, is one of the key things, like the sense of presence that the VR is allow us to give. So it's cool to just how you can use VR to just connect different people, no matter where they are located in the globe. So actually, it was really fun to create experience that allow you to just create this share of presence and educate people at the same time, like onboard them on how to do something in a product.
And Kyle?
Hi, everyone. I'm Kyle Monahan, and we do a lot of VR supporting classes and research. So we have HTC Vives and Meta, or previously Facebook, Oculus Quest 2s. And so we have a lot of those that we support. Most of that's around understanding visualizations, thinking about how we work with those visualizations. Personally, I also love using VR myself, so I mostly use it for exploring virtual spaces. I sometimes will pull my visuals in there and look at, say, a graph of residuals, move around that into three-dimensional space. It helps me deal with high-dimensional data sets as well. So lots and lots of data exploring that. Personally, I also love bird identification, so I tend to travel to places in VR before I go there in person. So just a useful secondary thing that you can do. And to what Krys and Nick said, that shared presence and the immersion that I get in being in a virtual space before I travel there is really a powerful experience for me.
Great, thanks everyone. So we'll dive into some of the questions and start this conversation around the uses of VR in education and kind of the future of it. For the attendees, if you have questions already, feel free to start populating them in the Q&A portion of Zoom, and then we'll get to those toward the end of the presentation. So the first question I wanted to ask is, where do you think the biggest opportunity is for using virtual reality in the educational space, particularly in a transformative way in the future? And I'll let Nick kick us off on this question?
Well, I think that VR can change the way we educate people, especially given the specific context. For example, when it comes to history lessons, you can not only imagine how it will look like, but actually see how the things were back in, for example, in the beginning of the Earth. And it's completely different experience when you see it in your own, using your own eyes. And the same thing, like any other subject, not only history lessons, but chemistry, for example, you might see how exact atoms and molecules work. And this gives you a better understanding on how these processes works. And you not only read it as a dull formula, for example, but you can actually see the exact process. And one of the key thing I think is here is important, that is really important, is that when you see it using your own eyes, you understand it much better than when you read it, because you don't need to imagine anything. You just see it in exactly how it works. So yeah, I think this way will transform many subjects, and I think all of the subject that we learn in the university and in high school can be completely reimagined in a way we just communicate these topics.
Thanks. Kyle, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Sure. I think just to add on to Nick's point, I think we can also explore places that we couldn't normally explore with other methodologies, right? So one example would be, say, in medicine, we've seen a lot of use of VR and augmented reality to give us another viewpoint. I think also one example I'll bring in, which some of you may have not have heard of before, is in geology. So I have some people who work in volcanology. This is a very high risk area, right, where we have a lot of heat, a lot of pressure, a lot of chemicals, right? And if we want to explore, say, the geomorphology or the surface area of a volcano, which is an active area of research, it's challenging to do so, right? We can sit people right at that lip of that volcano in VR. They can get that same experience without the smell, without the danger, right, that you could get. And so as someone who used to do geology many years ago, this is an amazing experience to have, which with much lower hazard. So I think it's a powerful ability for education, and it's much cheaper. You know, you just pay for the headset. You don't have to spend I don't know how much money we spent to get to the rim of a volcano, but it's quite expensive and dangerous. So I think those sort of opportunities, democratizing those, making them equitable, I think is a really powerful way that VR could change the game a little bit.
I think that's such a good example of volcanology that I hadn't thought of, but you're right. Like, who really wants to go to the edge of a volcano even to study it? Like, that's quite scary and dangerous. So if you're able to do that, you know, from the comfort of your own couch or your office, I imagine you could do a lot more research way faster and certainly safer. Krys, I noticed you nodding along to what Kyle and Nick were saying. Would you like to chime in as well?
Of course. Yeah, I actually, so in a past life, I was a mentee for first generation students who are involved in STEM degrees. And so my mentee was a biochemistry major who came from a school district that wasn't that great. It didn't have really strong STEM classes, and she struggled with the molecular composition. And she was one of the beta testers for a VR technology where they could go in and manipulate the molecules and see where everything. She didn't understand it until she actually got to go in there with the controllers and begin to manipulate things and recreate and figure out why things were the way they were. Another thing that I thought was really interesting was some research that was being done in a VR environment that was being created by a teacher, where all of the students were AI generated. And so you have this classroom of fake humans that you can interact with as a teacher. And so what do you notice, and how do you position yourself in the room to make sure that the people who need you to be closer have you closer? And what do you notice even just from the front of the room? And that's an experience that you don't have until you have live humans in front of you. And now we can go in and procedurally generate a classroom and just throw these scenarios at people who are going to need this practice in just a few short years as they take over their own classrooms. Another really cool one that I saw was with nursing and having a nursing simulator that's in VR, where you have a a patient in front of you. And what they had noticed was that a lot of their students were lacking a lot of empathy. And so in this environment, they could actually begin to teach empathetic practices that a nurse can have toward their patient. And so we could procedurally generate a simulation that also helps us evaluate empathy. So it was a pretty neat application.
Yeah, that's really cool. It reminded me of something I had read, a little tidbit, which was one of the first applications of VR in education was actually in the 60s and related to flight simulation for the Air Force. And so that idea that you are creating simulated environments to train people for, real life experience, whether that's nursing or teaching, really is like the first idea of why VR could be used in education. But I also love this concept of using it as physical models and getting people to understand complex, either math concepts or science concepts, almost like what little kids do with Legos and building blocks, where they can, take things apart and put it together and kind of learn on their own some of the basics of, balance and things like that, but doing that in a simulated way for older students. I was hoping you guys could talk a little bit about how you see VR actually being integrated into classroom and learning experiences in the future. Would this be something like, computers are pretty ubiquitous today, laptops are often used in pretty much all educational settings, certainly after the pandemic. Would you envision it being something like that, or something that's maybe more on the side or used, occasionally by students? What would be your vision of it in the future? And Kyle, I'll let you go first on this one.
I would say there are two different levels that I would expect it to be integrated into courses. The first would be where we have a platform for engagement, right? Where we're looking for students to engage, right? Maybe it's a challenging topic. I always think of statistics because although I love statistics, I understand maybe not everyone had the same experience as me. I find that if I could take that formula, and right now we use visuals. We use a lot of GIFs or GIFs, however you want to say it, right? Animated materials to make it interesting, right? You look at the formula, then you look at, say, gradient descent, for example, in machine learning, and you see the small curve being approximated step by step, right? I could show you a graphic of that. Or we could look at it in VR. We could change parameters and we could see how that changes in the three-dimensional space rather than in the two-dimensional space that's available today. So that's the first one, a new platform for engaging people in content. I would say, secondly, there's places where you can create community around a space. So because VR has a social component, because it's so immersive, I think for some topics where we want discussion, right now we use a lot of breakout groups and things like that in Zoom if we're hybrid, but I think there could be an even larger area, because I have seen a lot of VR communities, particularly for people who don't normally engage in other types of communities. They feel more free in this open space. So I think that's a secondary opportunity for education.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. It reminds me of Nick's example earlier of using it for onboarding. Like you could potentially, create that community before you even come to the office, although I don't know how many people are going to offices anymore. So the virtual office, whatever that entails. Nick, did you have anything you wanted to add to where you see VR being incorporated into classrooms?
Yeah, I think that one of the topic I see might be really interesting to explore in education is like conducting different kind of experiments. For example, right now when we run scientific experiment, we try to do it like perfectly. Like example that for example, if it's chemistry experiment, so it should be all go as planned. But in VR, we can try different things and try to even break things because it's safe. Not in our physical classroom where any mistake might be cause any further damage for the team members. But in VR space, we can experiment and understand the consequences of our experiments better. So if we try to mix different things and we got the room full of like a fire, anything like that, it's still safe because it gives us a clear understanding of why it's happening and what you can or cannot do. So you can experiment freely and without any consequences whatsoever. And another thing is like, as Kyle mentioned, is a sense of immersion. I think it's extremely important because when you experiment in VR space, you like playing and working in your space, and you can design this space accordingly. So you might specific environment for your particular classroom, and make it as a sandbox for participants. For example, your lesson might be like a game, for example. Similar, like if you're familiar with the concept like Roblox, the companies run the sandboxes with games. The same approach can work in VR education. It's fun, it's engaging, and it gives us a lot of opportunity to just give users, participants, students, more chances to remember this experience and be engaged in this experience.
And Krys, I know you have something to say about gamification in the classroom. So I was hoping you could both talk about, where do you see VR becoming, in the classroom in the future, but also maybe a little successes of using VR and gamification in the classroom and how effective that can be.
You're just going to let me take up the rest of the hour, right? So with VR as something that VR could do in a classroom, for those of you who may not know, I have a library degree, and I was really interested in special collections and like the artifacts that different cultures and different areas have. And so you think about like being able to put your hands on in VR and rotate and explore just the research opportunities that opens up. Being able to go in and look at collections and explore new ideas and how different cultures and different aspects of our shared history can interact. Like I think that would be amazing. But with gamification in VR, absolutely everything Nick said, going in and breaking things and figuring out how stuff works. If you hand me a new VR thing and ask me, I keep thinking of a conversation that I had with the dental school, and they showed me New York University has a VR for the Novocaine shot that you get when you get your teeth fixed. And I just think of like, I want to go in there and I want to like, what happens if I poke it in the forehead with this? And just being able to play around, not that I would hope a dentist would never do that, but there are opportunities, especially in these different types of environments that we come into with engineering and with medicine to some degree, where a level of play that we've never been able to have before can actually help us make new discoveries, or at least new approaches to some of our biggest challenges. My background's in education, so like being able to go in and explore how maybe different seating arrangements can help with different types of learning, and how do we pair people up, and what would happen if we rearrange things in such a way that we completely break down the walls of the classroom and break out of those rows and columns. So yeah, the gamification there is fantastic. And plus also just the immersive aspect of VR with gamification. A lot of times we're trying to go toward a behavior shift. And if people can see themselves doing the behavior, so if I can see myself going in and being a nurse, it becomes more real to me. I am immersed in that world. I'm not a nurse. I fear for anybody who needs me to do nursing things to them, but I'm able to see myself in that environment, and I can then begin to make the connections with my identity that I need to make in order to maybe take the steps to become a nurse. So the gamification aspects there are fantastic.
Thanks. I think that's really interesting how the future of VR and education really has a few different legs to the stool. There's this idea that you all talked about of using it to improve the student experience, really immerse the students, help them, figure out complex issues, etc. There was also mention of sort of the training and research side that maybe teachers or administrators or researchers would be more interested in. Like Krys, you just mentioned simulating seating charts and kind of seeing how people would work in different environments, which I think can be helpful. And then that trial and error, the seating charts, I think, is a good one. You can trial and error much faster, and there's really no ramifications of doing that in a virtual environment versus in your actual classroom where you're moving people around. And then similarly, I loved Nick's example of the chemistry lab and being able to kind of mix things together, blow it up, see what happens in that safe environment where you're not actually blowing up your classroom. So I think that's really interesting. The next thing I wanted to talk about is, with any new technology, there's positives and negatives. And I wanted to get thoughts from each of you of, what are some of your concerns about using VR in education? And are there boundaries that people should be aware of as they're getting more interested in the space? So Krys, I'll let you start this time.
This is the question that I absolutely love. So the group that I used to work with at another institution was challenged with VR things. People would come to us to build VR environments. And some of the things that we would talk to them about, number one is just VR has a prohibitive cost. It takes forever to build the stuff. Technology updates. When you buy a headset, it might not be good for 5 years. It might only be good for a couple of years, and computers constantly updating. So there's a significant investment that needs to happen. And as higher education looks at that, and as education looks at that, we need to understand who's going to shoulder that cost. Are we asking students to come with a laptop and a VR headset and maintain both of those for 4 or 5 years, or is the school going to shoulder that? And another one that always kind of seems to be slightly ignored is not everybody can use VR. I have dominant optic nerve atrophy. My optic nerve is dying and I can't do VR. So I put the headset on and it doesn't compute in my brain. And so how do we create similar experiences for people like me who really want to be in there, but just like cannot? And making sure that we make space for those types of experiences as well.
Yeah, I think the accessibility challenge is a huge one, both the financial accessibility, and then, as you said, not everyone can actually use the headset. I know some people get, motion sickness and those types of issues as well. Nick, I would love for you to opine on this as well, especially as a product designer. I'm imagining you think all the time about some of the concerns and challenges.
Yeah, accessibility is number one challenge, and I would specifically mention that many users experience motion sickness, especially when you be in a virtual world for me, it's like 20 minutes. After 20 minutes, I feel motion sickness. It's fun that different headsets give you a different sense of stability in this space. For example, when I experience VR using a Valve headset, I generally got prolonged sessions, like 30 minutes or more. But for Oculus Rift, it's around 20 minutes, and then I start to sense some motion sickness. But that's my personal experience. But as I've tested with different groups of users, most of the users experience motion sickness in about an hour or so. So it might be challenging because a training session or education session is typically around the hour or even more than an hour. So it's important to carefully plan the training session in order to prevent the motion sickness and balance the accessibility of the device and actual users. And another point, I absolutely agree with Krys regarding the cost and of the devices. Right now, it's like the Oculus is around $400 on sale, and it's kind of expensive. And the Oculus also gets out. The VR devices gets really out of date really soon. So the hardware is might not be up to date. It's similar with the mobile phones, but sometimes even they become outdated really faster. So I would say that if we want to use VR headsets in education, we need to have common standards and specific, I think, plan on how we will want to utilize the devices for education. For example, the device might serve us for 5 years or so. So yeah, and regarding the standards, what I also mentioned that there are no current standards like universal standards for VR spaces. Any company use their own specific guidelines on how to design for VR, but we still don't have a universal standards because this tech is not mass tech. For example, it's not widespread and everybody use the VR like mobile phones right now. But I would predict that by 2030, I would say that we will have that. So by 2030, we will likely have the common standards for VR headsets, and the audience will be familiar with the devices. And by that time, I would say that it will be my mainstream device for the education.
Thanks. And Kyle?
I'll just say I agree with Nick and Krys that accessibility is a huge need. I find myself, I have motion sickness when I come out. I almost want to go back in. I don't know if that was planned by the makers, but I feel like it resolves when I get back into my vibe or something like that. But I think one other thing I would bring up is around data privacy. You know, if you think about it, we are strapping a device with a bunch of grayscale cameras that's tracking everything in the room. If you have children in that room, right, or things that you don't want to be passed to those APIs or those web endpoints where people are processing that data, there's a huge risk there, right? So I use it all the time. I'm totally fine with any developer bug fixing something and seeing my messy room, right? But not everyone might be comfortable with that. So there are some really broad data privacy questions around that, around how we process that, what we can do on device, so on the headset, versus what gets pushed off to the computer. And so there's a lot of data security questions there. I also think one of the challenges is also enabling adaptation. So, you know, right now, one of the questions I get a lot from faculty is, do I have to redo all of my visualizations in VR, or do I have to eventually take all my slides and integrate them into this new platform right after I've been teaching for X years? So this is a real challenge for people that are doing instructional work. I know many of us are in that space, and it's hard to keep them up to date with what we have now. If we have to move an entire platform, that's always a challenge, particularly in the education space. So yeah, those are my two ads, but total agreement with everything the other panelists said before.
Yeah, I think those are great points. I think cost is a huge one, especially as universities deploy programs, and especially as we think about access to higher education, and even within primary schools, who funds that? It reminds me a lot of when computers kind of first came out. You'd often have, computer labs in some schools, and now a lot of schools, every student is issued a laptop, and it's kind of almost like a textbook. So curious if a model like that gets developed over time, where there ends up being more of a VR lab at a school. And then, as Nick said, as it becomes much more mainstream, maybe it's much more cost effective in the future. But certainly the speed at which the technology is changing is a big deal in the cost. I wanted to ask a little bit about the role that universities can play in the space of both advancing VR as a technology and also utilizing it in the classroom, either at the university level or supporting its use in other classroom environments, whether that's on the job training, as Nick mentioned before, or more in the primary and secondary school space. So Kyle, I'll have you start this one.
Yeah, I would say definitely what Nick mentioned before, that idea of on-the-job training, training people in these things is important. I think with that comes documentation and best practices. So for documentation, I mean, document, how do we get this thing set up? How do I do what I want to do? Sharing that with our end users and democratizing that, pushing that out online. I think one of my goals is always to get all of those internal documentation out onto the internet, searchable by everyone, so we can contribute to the broader educational space. I also think best practices, right? Because there's so much that are locked away in specific communities online, websites like Reddit, Facebook groups, etc., right, where people are talking about very specific things. Stack Overflow is another example for some data-focused things, right? Many of us know to go there, not everyone does. So I think it's about democratizing those best practices and making sure that we can make sure everyone has that available, and making it very easy for new users to get started. So those would be my two suggestions: documentation and best practices.
Yeah, I think that's great. Krys?
One thing faculty are really great at is just playing with the world around them and their fields. So one thing higher education can do is to kind of lean into that. An example is I saw something being done by BU with artificial intelligence, not VR, but integrating that with theater and using artificial intelligence to create a fifth space on a stage that the actors can play with. And so, like, if we apply that to VR, like, there's a really cool idea locked in some faculty member's head of, I wish my students could, that VR would be an answer for. And so beginning to support that and providing, of course, we always ask our institutions, providing the resources and the people who could potentially bring that to life. And again, what Kyle said, amplifying that out, like, hey, we're doing this really cool thing and we're ready to partner, or we really hope that somebody would come and make this better or tell us how we can improve it.
Nick, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Krys and Kyle regarding how the university will play with VR. But I would say, like, I think I see as a university as a sandboxes for VR technology. So it's a cool place to just experiment with tech, understand how it works, and also use it in a context that is potentially can be used for education. So it's like making the most of this tech. And then as I see it, is like the first standards of how VR should be used for education will emerge in the universities, and then everyone will apply the same principles in schools, in other educational institutes, everywhere. So I think that first the university will explore and understand how to use this tech on a grand scale. And then everyone will adopt it, this approach. In the context of education, of course.
Yeah, I think that's great. So we'll move on to the Q&A. If people have Q&A questions, feel free to start populating those in the Q&A field. I'll ask kind of one final question before we dig into that. So Krys and Kyle, both of you have been using VR with some of your students, and I know Nick, you've been using VR in consumer and business applications. I was hoping each of you could share just sort of what have the reactions been from students or consumers in some of the products or ways that you've used VR. Has it been positive, negative, somewhere in between? I'd just love to get a sense of that. So Kyle, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I would say students, we support a game design course here at Tufts that focuses on using VR for that purpose. And I would say students are so engaged. I actually still play a VR game that the students made. I don't even know that they know it, so I guess I'm announcing it at this panel right now. I literally love that experience. And it's the way that the students brought in these ideas. You actually play as a cat, so it's pretty cool for me to do that. And it's just a very cool experience. So I think, students have really engaged with VR. They do a lot of creativity and make amazing products from it. So I've really been impressed and I would say even astounded by the level of creativity and the different approaches that they take.
You should hook them up with Nick to sell their products. So Nick, I'll let you give some thoughts on what you've seen from your products.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Kyle regarding how you can feel about VR. That most of the time when our users using VR experience, like they were immersed in this experience, and it was completely different experience for them. In comparison to other product that they use. So the first was like wow effect that we achieved by using VR. And the challenge was to make it more accessible to different groups of users, because it's still like a huge problem in product design, because it can be hard to achieve the same level of accessibility because everyone have its own limitation. Some people have disabilities and it's extremely hard to design for these groups of users when you use VR. But the way people perceive the VR, like something new, something fresh, something exciting. And this is a really important thing in product design, because it creates memorable impression for users. They remember your product, and anytime they hear about your product, they have a positive impression about it.
Thanks. And Krys?
I keep coming back to this idea, or not the idea, this application of VR. They had the idea of a VR lecture at my last institution. So Day of the Dead is really big in Tucson. It's a large procession that happens through Tucson on Day of the Dead. And it's been going on for decades and it's huge. And we decided to take a 360-degree camera on the procession and gather people's stories as they're walking, of why they're walking that day and who they're representing and how long they've been coming here. And we were attempting to rebuild it in VR. So that way you can walk along with the procession in Tucson, and it be a lecture around the culture and history and everything around that moment, and that particular experience. I would love to see that done well. I would really love to see that done well. But other applications I've seen of it that have been cool is Biosphere.
Here.
Not the movie. We'll walk through that space. It's actually still an active research area. And so being able to take yourself on a self-guided tour and not have to do the 1.5-hour drive in the desert to experience it. But I think there's a lot of opportunities like that where time and space matter.
So I'll turn over to a couple of the Q&A questions. Feel free to keep adding if you haven't added your question yet. So this comes from one of the attendees, Stephen. I am a retired physicist and I'm interested in developing science-related VR applications. I have 2 questions. The first, what popular tools are used to create VR applications? And also, can VR applications run on inexpensive hardware like Google Cardboard or something similar?
There's a Unity is what my students use when they build VR environments in my gaming class. So that's probably the one area, and it's free. So that's one of the areas that you can look into. As far as inexpensive hardware with Google Cardboard, I'm not sure. I can leave that to the other 2, probably know a bit more. I always use my computer to render it. So
yeah, I would just add that we also use Unity. So to add that, but also if you use Unity, you can actually push it out to the browser, right? And you can do embedded VR experiences within the browser, right? So then users could point, a Google Cardboard or something similar to that and have a good approximation of what a VR experience would be like. As the other panelists mentioned, there is one risk here, particularly if we're moving through, if you're a physicist, let's say you're working, on, I don't know, bodies in motion sorts of problems. High motion in a environment in a Google Cardboard can be a little disorienting, right? So we do have to think about some design features that could get around that, but it's certainly possible to build something in Unity, an amp that does what you want it to do, and then push it out to the browser for people to be able to use. And I've done that once, so I know it's technically possible.
I think that kind of relates to another question someone had, which is how you can tackle accessibility issues that are built into VR and provide an alternative, but an equal option for students. So I'm imagining this is with people who maybe have motion sickness or those sort of issues, maybe pushing to the browser option is a way. It's not quite the same, but it gives a lot of the same features. Krys, with your own experience and issues with wearing a headset, is there anything that comes to mind for you about how things can be designed for you?
I think number one is making good choices about what you put into VR. If it doesn't really need to have that 3D immersive place, the browser works. But if you really need to be in it, there aren't, and there isn't an accessible way besides the 2D click and scroll, which is what I use. Yeah, well, and there's also like the 3D sound of whenever you're going into a space and that type of stuff, which can be really challenging for people who have hearing challenges. And we were attempting to create closed captions that you could like click and take with you. That didn't work out very well. So if you have a better way to do that, I'm all ears. But yeah, accessibility issues. The browser helps me with a lot of it. And then again, just making good choices about what you're doing. If it's VR for the sake of VR, it's not always the best idea.
Yeah, I think that I want to mention one thing, that how we overcome this problem, but I don't recommend this solution. We use the static picture that we show to the user instead of the dynamic experience. So whenever the user is looking for some object, they saw a static picture of that object, and then we to explain the object, we use the transcript. It might be the audio transcript or visual transcript, depending on the way the user want to experience this. And it solves some of the problems. So motion sickness wasn't that high for the particular group of users, but still it's like it's not the best solution for the problem. As Krys mentioned, it's really hard to overcome the accessibility issues because the way experience is provided, it has so many. It can cause so many problems in terms of accessibility. So you can mitigate some of them, but not all of them.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's the accessibility, both financial, but also from a disability perspective, is definitely one of the major challenges. I mean, I didn't give the obvious accessibility issue, which is if you're a blind student, you can't use VR. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done in that space. And in some ways that's exciting about new technology, is thinking through, how do you get for different users from across the board with different experiences to be able to use that technology in a way that works for them. So the next question is a little Tufts specific, but I'll ask it anyway for probably Krys and Kyle. But this user asks, they mentioned there are many labs at Tufts, like the Digital Design Studio, the Venture Lab, the Data Lab, which you work at, Kyle. How can Tufts help support building out labs for VR? Or more broadly, I guess any university probably has very similar lab type spaces.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question that I'll pass it to Krys to respond. I think I would say, in the data lab space, we wonder, what does it mean to have a virtual data lab? Right. And I think one of the ways we answered that is we have virtual support. So we have people there available via Zoom and chat that you could talk to depending on the level of need. I think some of the services we provide, such as data, access to geospatial data, for example, are ripe for VR exploration. Right now, they're just flat files with the name of the country and a description of the metadata in XML format. But it would be relatively straightforward to get those into a VR content and be able to view them and walk through the data that you could access in the data lab, right? So I think there are some areas, to Krys's point and Nick's point, when it's useful to use VR, that's when we'll start using it, right? So I think there are some use cases where VR would be a useful time saver and helpful to people that are into that. I think also supporting research is a huge thing. So use of VR for research and education in all of our labs, whether it's the DDS, the Digital Design Studio, or any of the data lab spaces. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there. I would say if you have any ideas, please feel free to reach out to me, because we are definitely open to it. And it's something I ask myself very often. How do we adapt to these emerging technologies? So thank you for the question.
Yeah, and I think Tufts could build out the VR spaces in areas that make sense, where it's not just put behind a wall where only faculty or only data scientists can use them. I went to a really cool presentation by CCSU. They just built out their first VR lab, and the students are going in and building things, and people are bringing their class in so that they can use the computers that they need to use and be able to use the headsets. And so if Tufts asked me, I would put it directly in the center of the big library on campus and just open it up to everybody and encourage people to use it.
Yeah, I think the making it somewhere that people know it's there and encouraging to use it is always great. I'm always surprised in my own educational experience when there's like labs at the end of the hall around a corner with no window on the door and like a tiny name plaque, and you're supposed to magically know, what goes on behind that. So I think for anyone to use it, it would have to be in a much more obvious space than the end of the hall. So the next question is from one of the participants who's asking about a comment that you had made earlier, Krys, and expanding on that. They write, Krys talked about the ability for VR to allow students to see themselves in roles such as nursing. There are many possible applications for this, for VR in this way. In light of the fact that VR has many costs, how would you decide when VR is worth it for that particular application? I think this gets along to what we were talking about, this accessibility as well, which is, when do you pick VR as the right tool versus not?
When the stakes are high, I guess, is the way that I would answer that, especially with the identity aspect of it. So there are a lot of STEM places where people don't see themselves represented. And so when you don't see yourself represented in a population, you don't think that that's an option for you. So for those, yes, absolutely, because we need we need diverse individuals in many of our fields. But more broadly, when it's worth the application is when you can't replicate it in a safe and effective way any other way. So if we have, I keep thinking of the wind turbines for power generation, like we can't take an entire class up the pole hundreds of feet in the air to fix something. Like that's dangerous and 30 people just don't fit. And so we could use VR in that aspect to be able to show people how the motor works and where it lives and how you access it, so that we don't have accidents, and we're giving everybody the same experience to be able to ask questions and learn off of each other. The twofold answer, one is, where people can need to see themselves.
I think that's a really great point, Krys, which is the representation. That we'll keep using the nursing example. If you're going to nursing school and there just aren't a lot of people in your class that look like you, there aren't a lot of faculty that look like you or come from your background, being able to kind of replicate that in VR or give people access to potential patients that come from different places in the world would also be, I think, very useful. So that representation, I think, is a great point to bring up. Kyle or Nick, do you have anything else you'd add to that?
I would just add one thing that I always wanted a car repair VR app. I learned car repair because I have a lot of very nice friends and family members, and those skills are so useful. Mm-hmm. And they're locked away by identity, as Krys mentioned, as well as just access to the info, right? And I would love like a car repair, and then you could build into more advanced repair. We could train the people that would maintain the airplane fleet. You could have Boeing certified. There are all these certifications. Right now, they're using AR in a very limited way, right? Mostly for institutional large-scale investment. It's not yet there. I think that it would be a real opportunity for VR to come in. It's really safe to mess up something in a car in VR. To Nick's point about the chemistry lab, I think we could also have a car repair lab as our second app, right?
Very good point. So we have one more question, which is, what are the latency in predictive rendering problems that VR experts have been working on? And Kyle, I'll throw this one to you.
Yeah, I can say a few things. I know that in VR, we do use foveated rendering, and the others in the panel may know more than me about this, but that's where, because our eyes can only see the center most of the time, and we do saccades where our eyes are moving back and forth very rapidly. So we only have to render the center of an image at very high resolution. Also, we can play around with refresh rates. So these screens tend to be high refresh rate screens. That means it's changing the image very quickly in the amount of frames per second or the hertz of the display. And so because of this, we can basically only render where we need to render, which is where you're looking, right? And so that's been useful. I know that they're really focusing on predictive rendering. So predicting where you'll look next, given this thing that we've set up. If we know where someone's looking and what's happening in the game or in the visual, we can then predict where they'll look next. So I've seen some really good salience mapping of the probability of where someone will look next. I know that this is an interesting problem. The challenge again is the compute, because we're wearing this thing on our head. If it's one of these standalone VRs where the compute is in there, we're challenged with the amount of RAM and compute we have. We have to be real creative with how we store these matrices. And then if we're offloading it to the computer, that's got to be a pretty strong computer. And now we get into accessibility. Who can afford the $6,000 gaming PC, given that GPUs are impossible to find, right? So so it's a challenge, but certainly something that people way smarter than me in VR are working on now. And so it's something to think about. Great question, though.
And we have another question that came in. This question is, do you think that VR will become more accessible in the future? It seems like companies like Meta are struggling to get VR as a mainstream product out the door. And so I might throw this one to Nick, just because he's in the product design space a bit, and you had given that prediction that by 2030, VR would be mainstream. So love your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think that Meta is like the pioneers of VR, and the people that work in that area. I mean, like people like John Carmack, they are like pioneers in this space, and they create a foundation for this entire space. And on top of that foundation, we will see the completely different space in the next decade, for example. Because as I compare it to the mobile phones. For example, the first mobile phones, accessible mobile phones, they appeared in the market in the late 90s, early 2000s. And the situation changed completely in 2008 when the iPhone released. And especially the first years after that, like 2010, it was the era of mobile devices. The same thing will happen to the VR, I think. We are like at the beginning of this technical revolution. And indicate by 2030, when the tech will be less expensive, I mean the tech itself, the computer power will be more less expensive too, because our computers will be capable of doing more things. And the sensors, as Kyle mentioned, that is used for predictive rendering, they also will be more sophisticated and less expensive. So I would say that the device will cost less and be more frequently used than it's used right now. Because I agree that right now it's like a nice, cool toy to play with, but it doesn't have much practical value for the mass audience because it's expensive and you cannot do a lot of the tool right now. But that's because it's still in the early phase of development. And I would say that the situation will change a lot after the Apple will release the headset, and it should be happen in the early days of the June of this year. And then I say that the traction will be completely different after that. So we will see a completely different story in the next few years.
Krys and Kyle, do you agree that it will be mainstream?
I mean, in gaming, that's the main, like, I keep thinking like VR Skyrim, and how that changed and reignited a decade-old game. But yeah, that's where my brain goes to with VR and mainstream.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would agree. I think I'm not sure about the timing, but I do agree with Nick. When Apple releases that headset, it will change the game. You know, Apple tends to push forward. People tend to follow them once they release for mainstream things. I think they'll, you know, it looks like their developer kit is also relatively robust right now, what they plan on releasing. So, you know, if that's true, then I think that would be a huge game changer. I also think one thing we haven't talked about is one of my favorite use cases, which is virtual desktops. You know, I have it set up to access my own desktop. I can remote into 10 machines and see all of the monitors in my virtual space at relatively high resolution. I could never afford that many widescreen monitors to display content, but I can see it in my VR setup, right? So I think as that develops as well, you know, VR not only as a gaming platform, as a visualization platform, but as access to our variety of computing devices, whether they're tablets, you know, desktops, etc. I think that could be a bridge between our current computing environment and into VR.
Yeah, really neat use case. So we're going to go ahead and wrap up. I want to thank the panelists for joining today and for giving their thoughts. It was a wonderful discussion. And I also want to thank everyone who participated as a participant in this. If you want to learn more about our certificate program, I put the link up on the slide. You're also welcome to follow us on social media. All three of our panelists are tagged in our latest LinkedIn post, so feel free to follow them as well. And hopefully everyone can join us for our next event. Thanks.